The monarchy versus the media, it's a much maligned relationship to say the least, as shown in part 1 of BBC Two's explosive documentary.
Particularly the tabloids are like a puppy. They will roll over and let you tickle their tummy for a while, but eventually they'll bite you.
The princes and the press alludes to the fact that the royal family is just as much a part of the problem with their public perceptions.
There is a far greater level of manipulation that goes on from the royal courts to the media than Joe Public would ever believe.
An unprecedented joint statement from the Queen, Prince Charles and Prince William, has been released, expressing their disappointment for the network, as the documentary suggests that brothers William and Harry were involved in a smear campaign against each other. And taking us on a deep dive into this doco this morning, royal commentator Angela Mollard. Ange, good morning. Mixed reviews surrounding part 1 of The Princes and the Press. It seems the main concern from the palace is they weren't allowed to see it beforehand, so therefore no right of reply.
Yeah, look, I think this is enormously short-sighted from the BBC, who is, of course, the public broadcaster in Britain. And we know that people like Kate have worked with the BBC on programmes in the past. Right. They weren't allowed to see it. And the fact is they've come out with this incredibly rare statement in using that sort of language, you know, overblown, unfounded claims, and to make that very specific point that, including the BBC, that this behaviour is disappointing.
OK, so let's get into the nitty-gritty. What did this documentary say? Because they spoke about the unspoken rule, the deal that exists between the palaces and the press.
Well, this is at the heart of how we report on the monarchy, is that they get to live in the palaces and they are taxpayer funded to a certain extent, and in return for that, they give some access, they're shown in good light, they brief on things that are happening, journalists go on royal tours, and this was what this was about, the deal and how it works. That's on the superficial level. It should all be in harmony. It's absolutely not, and this is what this documentary shows, and why it's actually quite explosive. OK,
so private investigator Gavin Burrows, who was allegedly hired by the News of the World, revealed voicemail and computer hacking went on into the early 2000s. He accessed private medical records and a list of the ex-boyfriends of Prince Harry's female companions. There's such a dive on this. He was interviewed for the very first time for the documentary. Let's have a little look now.
But I think it developed into more of an argument over who takes priority. You know, we're a big story, but we're not getting enough support, and we're not getting the right support.
OK, so what was that grab in relation to?
Oh, look, that was talking about the relationship between the palace and the peers. What Gavin Burrows came out and said, and he was effectively a private investigator working, and he was talking about the work that he did in basically finding about Prince Harry's girlfriends. It was quite shocking. I mean, I knew this went on. I worked in the UK during these years, and of course this is what led to the Leveson inquiry, which led to the shutting down of a newspaper, the News of the World in Britain, and it shows that real toxicity at the heart of this relationship. So, you know, look, I think for the first time, readers and viewers are actually getting to see that this is an industry, that it's very symbiotic, this relationship, and that it's really quite dangerous.
And so they're saying that Harry and William pitted stories against each other.
Look, that's what I think is going to come out more in the second part of this documentary. And what's really interesting, Kylie, is that they're not running them back to back, that there's a week's gap. And I think the BBC is being very careful with this and seeing what the palace's response is and before they make the claims. The palace has come out and said that's absolutely not right, that the two brothers, William and Harry, do not brief against each other. And what that effectively means is that their staff, protecting their brand, they have individual brands called principals. William is a principal, Harry is a principal, that they're effectively selling a product, and they're trying to get a good, they're wanting to see them to be seen favourably. What the palace is saying is that they haven't said bad things about each other. What the journalists are saying is that actually is what's happened, that they've been briefed by people in the palace, a story that's positive William versus negative Harry. The next part of this will show a lot more, I think.
Yeah. Daily Mail journalist Richard Kay has said the release of this doco is actually poorly timed, given the inquiry into Princess Diana's interview with Martin Bashir, because that is obviously still so fresh. What do you think?
Oh, look, I tend to agree with Richard, and he says, he uses the word incendiary. I'd be very careful if I was the BBC. I'm really surprised by that. We're still looking at the fact that Princess Diana was trapped into giving that interview because of falsified documents which suggested that she was being spied on, that her whole motivation for doing that interview was based on duplicity by the BBC. For them to now come out with this program, look, I know it's great for ratings. I mean, we know this thing will rate its socks off because we are, all of us, and you have to think we as an audience are complicit in it as well. We're interested in the royal family, but very poor timing.
But to that end, don't you think there should be some transparency, and that you say Joe Public should know that maybe this is what goes on behind the scenes, or not?
Absolutely. And look, you know, as I said, I worked in Britain during the 90s when we didn't know this thing, that how the public didn't know how the press worked and this sort of relationship. But I think the real power for the royals is in social media. They now have their own voice, you know, mouthpiece. They didn't have that back in the 90s. And if I were them, I'd be running their social media and then giving a bit of access, because of course people always want to know what's happening behind the scenes. The royals never told us that Prince Harry was seeing Meghan Markle. It took a journalist to discover that, and we want to know that. But it's a very tenuous relationship, and how that's managed going forward, particularly when the Queen passes, I think will be really interesting.
OK, so part 2 next week. We'll save you that spot on the couch.
Thanks, Larry.
Thanks, Anne.